who is my dear friend and first my brother. We're both born on the same day, and they say age before beauty, but this round it's beauty before age because he's younger. And he's an incredible human being. He travels the world as a teacher. And he is the co-founder of Quail Springs Permaculture Farm. Is that correct? Co-founder? And also co-founder or founder of Casitas Creamery. It doesn't matter. Anyway, he created Casitas Creamery too. He dreamed that one up recently. Like Quail Springs wasn't enough. But it's the first organic dairy farm on the central California coast. Yeah. He has a foundation that has a 200-year plan, and he's bringing back that kind of memory for people to really plan 200 years in advance, because that's how we should really think, you know. He travels the world, opening up people's hearts and sets them on their path to be really good tenders of their inner landscape and the landscape that they choose to be at. I'm really grateful, you know, to be on the journey with him. And I'm really grateful that he gives my indigenous Chumash relatives access to their homelands and always invites me back home to co-teach with him. But to give us access to our ancestral place of being, we don't always get that access. And in the kindness of his being, you know, he gives that to us. And I'm really grateful for that. And so I present to you my brother, who will give you such a treat for exactly 23 minutes, they told him. I wish it were longer, you know, but enjoy him and introduce yourselves to him and support him in every way you know how, because he's so beautiful.
Lovely, thank you. Up here in my Canadian tuxedo. Well, it's good to be here with everybody, and it's such an honor. Your life energy is so valuable, and so I don't want to waste a moment of our time together. And I'm just to get a feel for the room here. How many people here are the black sheep of their family? Woo! Interesting. How many of you, keep your hands up, how many of you that didn't raise your hand are from families that are black sheep? So there's a few of us that are working the edges, aren't we? I think of this idea of the black sheep, and that comes from herds of sheep, mostly the non-dominant gene that comes out expresses itself as a sheep that's dark in color. And so it's very rare in a lot of the sheep herds. And so they'd say, oh, the black sheep's the odd one out. But what I've found is that oftentimes the black sheep are the ones that are the edge dwellers of their family. They're the ones that go to the edge to try to translate new energy into a system. And when you look at systems theory, that is how new energy gets translated into a new system, is by coming through the edge. It can't come from the center. And so I applaud all of us that are doing work, whether we're in Palestine or Israel or in Liberia, or wherever we are in the world, to go to the edge, to bring peace, to bring a new energy into the work of the world, to help things be nurtured into life. And that's a lot about what I want to talk about today, is how do we nurture life? And so let's talk here. One common thread I find in peacemaking lot of the work that I've done around the world and a lot of the work that I see so many others who have broad concentric rings of peace, there's a common thread. And that thread oftentimes looks like gratitude. And so we see that different peoples who have had a huge effect on landscapes, both socially as well as ecologically, always work through a lens of gratitude. And the things that they're not grateful for, they metabolize into something that they could grow again to become something that they can be grateful for, something that's life-giving. And so I want to share a story from one of my teachers, a man named Jake Swamp. Have any of you heard of Jake Swamp, who very, very recently, in the last 5 years ago, he passed away. And I'm a storyteller, so this whole 20 minutes we have together is going to be stories, basically. And so Jake shared with me a story the last time that I saw him alive. And we were sitting in a kitchen in Goleta, just north of Santa Barbara, and it was just a little bit before he had passed. And he shared this story of a time when on the reservation for the Haudenosaunee people, because he's from the people of the Longhouse in upstate New York, and he shared how on their reservation that they have this beautiful river that moves through this place that they call Mother. Like, she is Mother. All the sustenance that they gain from that place, that's who they suckle from. And he told me of this time where people were getting these very weird sicknesses and illnesses. And where they were starting to see babies born with deformities. They were starting to see how, like, elders were getting premature deaths. There were a lot of in utero problems. There was a lot of people having a hard time getting pregnant. And they realized something environmental was going on. So they called in the New York State Health Department. And they came and tested soils. They tested the water, leaf tissues, blood. They did this whole array of checking into the landscape of this reservation. And what they found was that there was a toxicity of certain banned chemicals that came from a particular industry that was coming through the waters. So imagine now all their gardens, all their spigots of where they get their water, all their laundry, everything was being washed in these chemicals. And it started to permeate through the people. So they started to search upriver for where could this be coming from? Where could these chemicals be coming from? And as they made their way up the river, they got to this factory that was a few years old. And they tested the water outside the factory, and they found that it was highly concentrated with those exact chemicals. And then they went just above the factory, and there was no presence of those exact same chemicals. So they knew they had found the culprit. So they set up a meeting with the administrators of that particular industry, that building, that factory. And they sat down with them, and they had their lawyers, and they had the health department, and they shared their story of all the horror that they were experiencing, and all the illness and all the sickness that was happening because they were putting this chemical in their mother. And they listened, and the lawyers were looking through their books and basically said, at that point in time, it was still legal to put it out there. And they said, because it's still legal, we're going to keep doing it. And Jake was like, well, legality doesn't mean that it's actually ethical. Like, where's the ethic in that? And they said, it doesn't matter. It's what's legal. And he went on to tell me that there's a direct relationship between the more culture you have, the less laws you need. And the more laws you have, the less culture you have. And that really stuck with me. So he came back and was talking to the tribe, and they decided to fight this. They said, you know what, let's raise awareness about what's happening, and maybe people will band with us. And so he started writing letters, going on interviews, doing all of these outreach-type marketing things about their story, public service announcements. And after about 1.5 years, they had made such a stink on the eastern coast there that the parent company who owned the factory agreed to let Jake give a 45-minute presentation. And that 45-minute presentation was at their board of directors meeting at the parent company in their high-rise building in New York City. So all of the people in the tribe elected Jay because he's an incredible orator, and he was just such an amazing speaker and could bring you to your knees in tears of gratitude with his words. He just had that way. And so he practiced, he got all the charts together, and that was before these fancy digital things. And he did flip charts with all the different data that they had come up with and all the things backing up what was happening with them. And they ended up practicing it so that it was 45 minutes perfectly. And the day came, and he went to New York City. He gets to this high-rise building. And he gets to the door, he goes in, and he goes to the security guard and says, "Hi, I'm Jake Swamp, I'm here for this meeting." They said, "Oh, we're waiting for you, Mr. Swamp." And they brought him to a special elevator. And this was the elevator to the penthouse. Very ornate, very opulent. And he walks in, and he said he looked around, and it was like gold leaf, and it was, hardwoods from the tropics. And he thought, wow, this opulence is built on the back of other people's illness and sickness. Like, I wonder if the people who ride that even know the horror some people have had to face, the suffering that people have had to face, to be able to have a ride up an elevator in something that probably costs more than all their houses on the reservation combined just for that elevator. So he said something was happening. He said he got in that elevator and he could feel everything churning. And he gets up to the penthouse. He walks into the boardroom. And same thing. Everybody's in their $4,000 Italian suits and board table, gold leaf. And he said right then, his heart cracked open. It's like that Leonard Cohen song, You guys like Leonard Cohen? Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And he said at that moment, something cracked in his heart. And he knew that he wasn't going to give the 45-minute presentation that he planned. He knew he had to draw into his indigenous knowledge and a gift of a great peacemaker from a long time before had given their people 1,000 years before at a time of great strife a gift of what was called the Thanksgiving address. It was so simple. So they set him up, he had his flip charts, and he just never opened them. And he started with this gratitude, this Thanksgiving address, where basically he gives thanks to all the layers of the world with his finest words. And I'm going to just give a few because I also want this time together to be wrapped in gratitude. So he started like many of us do when we give our gratitudes to the soils of the earth. And he said, these soils hold all of our ancestors. Like right now in this building, think about that. Right now, we're sitting here on the backs of the ancestors of people that have lived here for thousands of years. Like literally, not figuratively. We are on top of them here. And he was giving gratitude because imagine we're going to go there and become a part of the soils. We're going to merge with those soils. And we're so grateful because out of the soil comes great new things from seeds. Great new things from all the carbon that's sequestered in those soils. Think of that energy of sequestered carbon in the soils. When it's held in the soils in a healthy way, it actually is the life-giving force that allows new life to come out. It is the life force of Mother herself. The eternal feminine in the earth is that holding of that potential of new life to come out. And we'll be a part of it. We're going to merge with her, which I just love. So he gives gratitude for the soils. And then he gives gratitude for the waters of the world. And he talks about how everywhere you go in the world, we are connected through our waters. I've heard this common theme throughout this whole 2.5 days of just, the water. And we come from the sea. We come from the amniotic waters of our mother and the beauty of being an ocean being coming out into being an earthen being. Like our whole story of evolution happens in a birth. And I'm so grateful because most of us are water. Most trees are water. We are water in a water world. And I was thinking of sharing this slide here up in the right-hand corner. When I was in Liberia, the women, even though it was post-war Liberia, where brutality reigned for 15 years, the stories I heard there, I couldn't even imagine living through. At the end of the war, what they needed, they said, was to get back to the ceremonies to feed the water so the world waters know that there's ceremonies for them. And they went right back into it, and they invited me to come. on this ceremony to feed this water of this one stream that flowed all the way to the ocean. And what they told me, they said that by us doing this ceremony, we're helping the whole world heal, not just Liberian women. Said, this is not about me. It's not about ceremonies for us. It's about ceremonies to keep the world alive. And I thought, wow, that's so selfless. You know, they're coming out of this war realizing they've got to get back to work to keep the world alive. Whew. I love that. I love that. The waters of life. I think of, even in our old traditions, a lot of us who have European ancestry. Like if you look back in the histories of like Herodotus and you hear the stories of the Scythians, it's like you were put to death if you didn't take your shoes off walking through the waters, because it was holy. And here it is, we have an opportunity to relearn the ceremonies of water in our own way, in our own, you know, the waters we're drinking here from Hetch Hetchy Reservoir in the sacred mountains of the Sierras. Just knowing that when you take a drink honors it. Knowing that which sustains us. I think of the trees of the earth, and we give gratitude for the trees, and that's what Jake was doing. He was giving gratitude to all the layers. And when I think of my gratitude for the trees, I think of projects like you see here, which is, any of you know Amma, the Hugging Saint of India? She is one of my heroes, but I do a lot of work for her, and this was my first project of designing this orphanage. When I came in, it was on a dump site in Kenya, outside of Nairobi. And you can see there wasn't very much soil, was there? It was very hard, rocky fill land that had gone in over the top of it, and the landfill, and basically an orphanage was built on it. And she came in because there was a lot of lawns and roses had been planted, and she said, well, how are we going to feed the kids with lawns and roses? Let's put food in, and that's when they got a hold of me to come and do some design for it. And so 2 years later, that's the exact same spot with a food forest. It can be done, even on a dump site, if you have the will. We have the knowledge to harmonize with Mother, to grow things beautifully and bountifully. I love what Jeanette said about grace today, and talk about growing food to feed ourselves and our community around you. There's so much grace in that, and so thank you, Jeanette. And then we give gratitude, as Jake did that day in that boardroom, to the cosmos, to the stars. And I love a lot of traditions. They talk about, indigenous traditions, talk about the stars that you see are the roots of the next layer of the next world. So when you pull your carrots and your potatoes out of your garden, you're actually pulling a star out of the world of the next layer below us. And I love that. I love that we are star beings, and that we, come from navigation of this world by remembering to look up, to actually see the stories in the stars, to know how to navigate through this world. There's a lot of metaphor for us here in our time right now. What is it that we navigate by? We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. And then he talked about Jake as he's in the boardroom, and he was telling me, when he was telling the story, he said, I'm doing this from my heart, and he's giving gratitude for all these layers. And he said there were still people in the room shaking their head going, stupid Indian is wasting our time on an audible level. Can you imagine that? But he kept going because his heart said to give his finest words. And so he gave gratitude for all the ancestors that have ever been before us. Like each one of you in this room, you are the sum of everybody in the line that you come from. Think about that responsibility. Think about the grace that's been given to you to be alive as the living link between that which we've never been to that which that came before us. You are that living link. And so I really want to just give gratitude for our ability to be that link between the two. And at the end of that great oration that he gave, they said, you've got to leave, Mr. Swamp. And so he was sad. He said he cried the whole way home, and he said he thought he had failed his people. And when he got home, they said, well, Jake, Uncle Jake, what was the story? And he told them the story. And they said, Uncle Jake, you followed your heart. That's what's important. You followed your heart. And so he thought, wow, okay, I did what I did. The next morning, he got a phone call. And that phone call was one of the board of directors who said, in a very shaky voice, I haven't slept the whole night. I can't even fathom what I'm doing right now. With the beauty of your words, I've never heard such beauty about the land in which I live when I've only seen it as a resource to be exploited. He said, I just can't imagine how I could go on doing what I'm doing. So what we need to do is you work from the outside, I'll work from the inside, and we're going to change the policies of this company. And that's exactly what they did. They changed the policies of that company, not for just that one factory, but worldwide for that entire corporation. Yeah. Thank you. And by one man following his heart, one woman following her heart, we have so much power. But it's not linear. You know, it's not linear. It's a time of the heart. It's the time of divination. It's the time of us evolving into using all of our senses to be able to meet the needs of gaining our sustenance. Because truly, if you look, the eternal feminine is the earth. It is her. It's not the goddess is separate from her. If you look at the story, and I just want to share this, if we go back to Mesopotamia, you start to realize that many of us prescribe to an origin story for Mesopotamia that has nothing to do with where we come from. We've just prescribed to an origin story. We say our umbilical comes from this place, yet almost all of us don't. And yet that's the story of the Jewish, the Muslim, the Christian. And it's the story that we're taught. And if you see what happened, that indigenous people who are intact with their landscapes, they see the land. They see that it's her. She is the goddess. But as we started to get into the Bronze Age, what we started to see was the goddess separated from the land into Ishtar, into Satanaya, into all these goddesses who moved away with the invent or the domestication of metals, which was also our ability to change the landscape dramatically, which was really thousands of years ago, 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, I believe was the beginning of what has caused this climate weirding. And I call it climate weirding because climate change is normal for the Earth. But we're really weirding it out now. And so I like to use the right vernacular with that. So then imagine now, copper and tin make bronze, right? Very little heat is used. And so with copper, very little destruction has to happen. Very little destruction has to happen to create bronze. And so there was still this maintenance of the female from the Mesopotamian story. But when you got the introduction of steel, what started to have happen was the high heats needed to create steel deforested all of it because of cedars. Cedars were the only thing that had enough heat to be able to smelt steel. And so all the forests within Mesopotamia, the cedars of Lebanon, that entire area was deforested. And that mentality has continued on for the domestication of steel and metals to be able to live very urban lifestyles that were actually separate from that which sustains us. So I want to bring this concept up to you of what is intact culture. Intact culture to me comes from a group of people who knows where all that sustains them comes from, and they honor those things deeply. Intact culture comes from a group of people who knows where all that sustains them comes from, and they honor those things deeply. Culture lives in her. She is culture in the land, bioregionally. And the more that we can realize that the closer we get to our knowing all that sustains us, being in relationship and honoring our relationship with her through relocalizing our shelter, water, fire, and food, we start to realize that culture will once again spring in a way that we have never imagined by being in touch with our shelter, our water, our fire, and our food. The relocalization of our basic sustenances will allow us to, again, find our place in cultural relevancy, where we're no longer, our umbilical cord is strung out to a place that we never originated from, but it's actually in the place in which we stand. And there's a lot of ways that we're doing this, and I only have a couple of minutes here, but I just a lot of it is just looking at how we convert and invest our time, our energy, and our money to move economic capital into natural capital. And we've been doing a lot of different works around what we call natural capital investment strategies. And I'll just show real briefly, we have a farm where we've done this, where we've said, let's build shelter, water, fire, food with taking money from oil stocks from a friend and converting them to soil stocks. Yeah. So I'm going to just end with this little story because that's one way to go. There's a lot of different ways that we can actually reroute our culture or reroute ourselves so culture expresses herself through us. And it brings me to this story of, how many of you know Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president of Liberia? One of my all-time women heroes. I was coming back from northern Liberia, and I got to this place where she was on the radio, on UN military West African radio, which is where the week before I had done a talk for an hour on permaculture there. But this time I was in the car and I was listening to her, and she said, Liberians, there's one thing we can do. There's one thing we can do to keep from going back into a brutal civil war. And I'm like, I'm going to pull over. This sounds pretty good. She said, there's one thing we can do to keep from our children dying of malnutrition. Liberians, there's one thing we can do to empower ourselves to not have to bow to Western interests. And now I'm like, okay, what is it, Ellen? This is amazing. There's one thing we can do. And she just kept going. There's one thing we can do to maintain our nobility as a people on this earth so we don't have to repress others. Whew. She got down to it. She said that one thing is that she wants everybody to grow a garden in Liberia. Think about that. It doesn't raise your GDP as a president. It took a great-grandmother president to say, you know what? Fuck the GDP. Yeah. Where our benchmark of wealth goes up if you get cancer. It goes up if we have a war. That's not our wealth. That's not what we're striving for. And she had the clarity to be able to bring this to the people there. And so I passed that message along with you, with also Bill Mollison's words that so many of our problems can be solved in the garden. And that's bringing it back home so we're in relationship with that which sustains us. I believe that's where peace begins. And so just with that, I want to put a final slide on and just say, thank you and namaste.
Thank you so much, Lauren.